Welcome to video 9. Today we're going to be talking more about quadratic exam problems. So this first one here, the demon drop at Cedar Point in Ohio takes riders to the top of a tower and drops them 60 feet. A function that approximates this ride is h equals negative 16t squared plus 64t plus 60, where h is the height of the riders in feet and t is the time in seconds. To the nearest tenth, how many seconds does it take for the riders to hit the ground? So the key things out of this, we should always highlight. What is most important is that we have this function representing that drop, and h is standing for the height in feet, and t is the time in seconds. Then I'm also going to highlight my rounding directions to the nearest tenth. We're looking for how many seconds. So that means I don't know the t value. If I don't know the t value, they must have given me the height. So does it take for them to hit the ground? Or I'm sure they're talking ground of the tracks. So that's going to be a height of 0. So I'm going to put 0 in place of the h, the height. So that's probably the most difficult part about these questions, is just knowing how to set them up. And we're looking for the nearest tenth, so that tells me that this is probably not going to be factorable, since they're saying I need to round. So I'm going to say it's either a better candidate for completing the square or quadratic formula. I'm going to use the quadratic formula to solve for t, because that is going to be smaller numbers than we had if we had to complete the square with this. I'd have to divide by negative 16 and then take half of that. It's just bigger numbers. So you'll want to have your reference sheet side by side whenever you use the quadratic formula so that you can fill them in as you go. So the formula is x equals, and then we have negative b, so I'm going to put negative 64. So the 64 is in parentheses just to keep it so that it's plugged in for b. And then fill in the rest, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times negative 16 times the 60, all divided by 2 times negative 16. So I plugged in all of my values. And if you need to, it might also help to write down off to the side what a, b, and c are, so that you knew when you plugged them in that you were plugging in the correct value. It just helps you stay organized with substituting into the formula. Once we've plugged everything into the formula, then we just have to simplify. So I'm going to leave that part up to you. But remember, when you simplify, you want to make sure you simplify the negative 64 here first, then everything that's under the radical. You want to put all of that in your calculator and hit enter before you even enter the radical. Because if it's irrational, you won't know what number is under the radical if you haven't simplified this first. Then we do the 2 times negative 16 to get that. And finally, you'll have those simplified pieces that you will need the pretzel method to simplify the final answer. Now, since this one says to the nearest tenth, we're not going to want to keep it as the radical answer. We're going to want to actually find what the numerator equals and then divide by the denominator to get an answer to the nearest tenth. And since it's a real-life question, we'll have to consider which answer to keep and whether we keep both or just one of them. So a few reminders for you when solving these word problems. You always need to figure out what they're asking you for, and it might not always be clear, so you might have to think, well, if they are asking me to find something, they must have given me something else. Like, for example, in this example, it said the ground. They didn't come out and tell you to plug in 0 as the height. You had to interpret that the ground meant a height of 0. Okay, so just remember to use one of the 3 methods. Unless it specifically tells you which one to use, you are free to choose from any of them. But in situations like this one, if you tried to factor, you probably would have gotten an answer that was not factorable. Okay, we'll continue this in class. Have a good night.